Hi, I'm Claire. My mother slapped my 5-year-old son so hard his glasses flew across the room. My brother-in-law laughed. My father just shrugged and muttered, "Kids need discipline." That night I realized they weren't family. They were bullies wearing the mask of love. So my husband, a Pentagon chief, made 3 calls from his office, and by sunrise their carefully crafted social empire began to crumble. But it didn't start with that slap. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It began years before, with conditional affection disguised as family values, emotional manipulation wrapped in tradition, and relatives who punished a child for simply being a child. The question isn't why they thought they could hurt my son, it's what happened when we finally stood against them. Before I continue, what time are you watching? Where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and tell me. What would you have done if your own mother struck your child and your family acted like it was normal? The invitation sat on our hallway table, its edges sharp against the dark wood. Cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering. My mother always insisted on what she called proper presentation. Her Christmas gatherings were legendary in Westbrook County, and the invitations were just the beginning. I stood staring at it, coffee mug growing cold in my hand. It had been almost a year since I'd spoken to my parents. Not a text, not a call, nothing but silence after our last argument when my mother insisted my son Jackson needed firmer handling, because he asked too many questions at dinner. I left that night with my husband Mark holding Jackson's small hand, the sound of my mother's criticism following us to the car. And now this, an invitation as if nothing had happened. Inside, her perfect cursive read, "Claire and family, join us for our annual Christmas celebration. 4 p.m. cocktails, 6 p.m. dinner." The tradition continues. Tradition. I nearly laughed. The tradition of judgment. Of expectations no one could meet. Of loving with conditions attached, like price tags. My hands weren't shaking from excitement. They trembled from everything building beneath the surface. Years of comments about my parenting, about Jackson being too sensitive, about Mark's military career being disruptive to proper family life. I sat down at our kitchen island, invitation still open, and tried to decide what felt worse, staying away or going back. Something in me knew it could be a trap. I wouldn't be surprised if we walked in and found some orchestrated scenario designed to prove my mother right about something. But another part, the part that once believed family meant safety, that helped my father build his garden shed, that stood beside my brother during his divorce, that part wondered, what if this is an olive branch? My therapist once told me that healing doesn't always arrive wrapped in apologies. Sometimes it comes disguised as difficult choices. I called Mark at work that evening. His voice was steady, as always. "What do you want to do?" he asked after I told him about the invitation. Not what we should do, what I wanted. This was why I loved him. "I think we should go," I said finally. "Jackson keeps asking about Grandma. And maybe things could be different." The pause on the line wasn't disapproval, just Mark considering all angles, as he did with everything. "Okay," he said, "but we go as a united front. Any problems, we leave immediately. No discussions, no arguments." I booked our flights that night, Charlotte to Boston, then a rental car to my parents' estate in Westbrook. I chose a simple blue dress from my closet, one my mother once said made me look practical, like a school teacher. I paired it with the pearl earrings Mark gave me after Jackson was born, not to impress her, but to remind myself who I was now. The flight felt longer than the 2 hours it actually took. Maybe it was the holiday travelers packed into every seat, or the way Jackson kept asking if Grandma would have his favorite cookies. I didn't have the heart to tell him she probably wouldn't remember, or worse, would remember but choose not to make them. By the time we pulled into the long driveway of my parents' colonial home, the sky had darkened to early winter twilight. Christmas lights outlined every window, perfect and symmetrical. My father's vintage Mercedes and my brother Carter's Range Rover already parked near the entrance. I noticed something as we approached the door that made my throat tighten. The custom doormat that used to read "The Clarks welcome you" had been replaced. Now it said, home of distinguished tradition. I almost laughed at the pretentiousness, but the message was clear. This wasn't about welcome, it was about their status. Mark squeezed my hand before ringing the bell. Jackson bounced beside us, 5-year-old energy impossible to contain. The door swung open, and there stood not my mother but Elena, her new house manager, clipboard in hand. "Names, please," she said with practiced politeness. "Claire Westfield," I said, keeping my voice even. "My husband Mark and our son Jackson." She checked something off her list and gestured us in without a smile. No warm embrace, no excited grandmother rushing to see her grandson, just protocol and procedure. As we stepped inside, the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. The house looked like a magazine spread, perfect garlands, matching ornaments, everything coordinated in gold and burgundy. I spotted the seating chart, displayed on an antique easel near the grand staircase. Table 1. Richard, Margaret, Carter, Diane, Senator Holloway, Mrs. Holloway. Table 2. The Prestons, the Williamses, the Johnsons. Table 3. Claire, Mark, Jackson, the Douglases. 3 tables. Ours the furthest from the main table, tucked near the kitchen door. I swallowed my disappointment and handed our coats to Elena, not a family member. No one rushed to greet us. No one said, "Claire, you made it," or scooped up Jackson for a hug. The first familiar face I recognized was my brother Carter's. He approached with his perfect smile, the one he used for business meetings and networking events. "Well, look who decided family matters after all," he announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. There was laughter, polite but pointed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father gave a quick nod from across the room, crystal tumbler in hand. He didn't move from his conversation with what looked like local politicians. My mother was nowhere to be seen yet. Making her entrance last was always her style. Mark's hand found the small of my back, steady and reassuring. Jackson tugged at my dress, asking in a stage whisper if he could have a cookie from the elaborate display. I led him to our assigned table, trying not to feel like we'd been sentenced to social Siberia. We sat quietly, making small talk with the Douglases, new neighbors I'd never met, while conversation flowed around us. Stories about Carter's law firm expansion, someone's daughter getting into Dartmouth, vacation homes in Aspen. Not once did anyone ask about our lives in Charlotte or Jackson's kindergarten adventures. My mother made her entrance just before the dinner bell. Margaret Clark didn't simply walk into a room. She arrived like royalty granting an audience. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her emerald dress obviously new and expensive. She moved through the crowd, touching shoulders, kissing cheeks. The perfect hostess. When she reached our table, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Claire, you made it," she said, as if my presence was uncertain until this moment. She bent slightly toward Jackson. "My, you've grown. Do you remember your grandmother?" Before he could answer, she was already moving on, not waiting for his response or offering a hug. Dinner was served at exactly 6. The turkey looked like something from a food magazine. The table settings gleamed with antique silver that had been in the family for generations. Plates were delivered by catering staff. Conversation dimmed to appreciate the presentation. Everyone seemed to be performing their roles in a play I hadn't rehearsed for. As the main course was being served, I felt it before I heard it. A shift in the room's energy, all eyes subtly turning toward the head table. My mother stood, champagne flute in hand. She tapped it twice with a silver spoon. Ping! Ping! The room quieted immediately. She smiled that hostess smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Friends and family," she began, her voice carrying without effort. "Before we continue our feast, I want to welcome everyone to our annual celebration of tradition and excellence." The room stayed silent, attentive. Even the waitstaff paused their movements. "When I look around this room," she continued, "I see success. I see commitment to values. I see people who understand that legacy isn't accidental. It's cultivated through discipline and standards." Her eyes swept the room but paused just a fraction too long on our table. "In every family," she said, voice lilting with practiced warmth, "there comes a time when we must reinforce what matters. What builds character. What separates mere relation from true family." She paused, letting her words settle. I felt eyes grazing our table like a physical touch. "Because sometimes," she said, her voice softening artificially, "we forget that children need structure, not coddling. That success comes from discipline, not from being told they're special simply for existing." A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the room. My champagne remained untouched. I felt my face growing hot as Mark's hand found mine under the table. Jackson, thankfully, was too busy carefully cutting his turkey to notice the speech wasn't just about Christmas values. "Permissiveness," my mother continued, sipping her champagne, "is the greatest disservice we can do to the next generation. Children need to hear no. They need correction. They need to understand their place in the order of things." Carter nodded enthusiastically from the main table. My father's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed satisfaction. They'd clearly discussed this speech beforehand. "That's why I'm so grateful for those of you who understand that true love isn't about making children comfortable, it's about making them capable." She smiled again, raising her glass higher. "To tradition, to excellence, and to proper values. Merry Christmas." The room echoed with Merry Christmas and the clinking of glasses. I sat frozen, Jackson looking up at me with questions in his eyes. Mark's jaw was tight, but he maintained his composure. Years of Pentagon meetings had perfected his poker face. The meal continued, but the damage was done. Every bite tasted like ash. Every conversation around us seemed to circle back to children who were well-behaved or properly raised. Jackson became quieter, sensing the tension even if he didn't understand its source. After dessert, guests began to mingle again. Jackson asked if he could look at the train set displayed under one of the smaller trees. I nodded, watching as he carefully made his way across the room, his small body navigating between adults with practiced caution. I was speaking with one of the Douglases when I heard it, a sharp cry that cut through the party chatter. My head snapped up, mother's instinct identifying my child's voice before my eyes found him. Jackson was standing near the train display, tears streaming down his face. Beside him stood my mother, her expression stern. I moved across the room in seconds, Mark right behind me. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside Jackson, whose cheek was bright red. He was trying so hard not to sob, his little body shaking with the effort. "He was about to touch the Lionel train," my mother said, voice clipped. "That set is an antique, worth more than most people's monthly salary." I stopped him. "By hitting him?" Mark's voice was dangerously quiet. "I corrected him," my mother replied, straightening her emerald necklace. A quick reminder that actions have consequences, something he clearly hasn't learned at home. The room had gone quiet. Jackson's glasses sat crooked on his face where they'd been knocked askew. I gently straightened them, my hands trembling with a rage I'd never felt before. "He's 5 years old," I said, standing to face her. He was looking at a toy train. "It's not a toy," she snapped. "It's a collector's item." And he was about to grab it with sticky fingers. Carter appeared beside her, smirking. "Some kids just need a firmer hand, Claire. You can't expect everyone to tiptoe around your precious snowflake." My father approached slowly, drink still in hand. He surveyed the scene with detached interest. Margaret was right to stop him. Serves him right for not listening to instructions. I stared at them. These people who shared my blood but apparently nothing of my heart. Jackson pressed against my leg, still fighting tears. Mark stood beside us, his military posture more pronounced than usual, face unreadable to anyone who didn't know him as I did. "We're leaving," I said quietly. "Don't be dramatic, Claire," my mother sighed. "It was hardly a tap. In my day, children got the belt for much less." I felt something snap inside me, not like breaking, but like clarity finally cutting through fog. "That's the difference between us," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You think hurting children makes them better. I know it only teaches them to hurt others or themselves." I picked up Jackson, his arms wrapping around my neck. Mark gathered our coats without a word. The room remained uncomfortably silent as we moved toward the door. "If you leave now," my mother called after us, "don't expect another invitation. Family means accepting correction, not running away when things get uncomfortable." I turned back one last time. Family means protecting each other, not using pain to control. Jackson deserves better than what you just showed him. We walked out into the cold December night, snow beginning to fall in soft, silent flakes. No one followed us. Not a single voice called out to apologize or to ask us to stay. That's when it truly hit me. Not suddenly, but like a truth I'd been avoiding for years. These people weren't family in any way that mattered. They were just people who expected compliance with their cruelty and called it love. In the rental car, I held Jackson while Mark drove, snow falling heavier now. "I'm sorry, Mommy," Jackson whispered against my shoulder. "I didn't mean to touch the train. I just wanted to see if the little door on the caboose opened." My heart cracked open. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart, nothing. Grandma was wrong to hurt you. No one gets to hit you. Ever. Not me, not Daddy, not grandparents. No one." Mark drove us straight to the airport hotel instead of back to my parents' house where we'd planned to stay. In our room, Jackson finally fell asleep, exhausted from emotion. Mark and I sat by the window, watching snow blanket the parking lot. "I want to make some calls," Mark said finally, his voice low and controlled. For 15 years in military intelligence, and now as a Pentagon deputy chief, I'd seen this tone, not angry but resolute. The voice of a man who had assessed a threat and was preparing to neutralize it. "What kind of calls?" I asked. "3, he said simply. "1 to correct a social situation, 1 to address a professional matter, and 1 to ensure your parents understand the consequences of assaulting our son." I didn't ask for details. In our partnership, there had always been areas where we trusted each other implicitly. This was one of them. "Do what you need to do," I said. He kissed my forehead and walked to the bathroom with his secure phone. I heard his voice, quiet but firm, as I sat watching Jackson sleep, his cheek still faintly pink where my mother's hand had left its mark. What I didn't know then was how those 3 calls would unravel the social, professional, and financial fabric my parents had spent decades weaving. By morning, the first threads would already begin to pull loose, not because of revenge or malice, but because some actions simply cannot stand unchallenged when a child's safety is at stake. The snow continued falling outside our window, covering everything in clean, forgiving white. I touched my son's hair gently, promising him silently that the family we chose would be better than the family we were born into. That night, watching him breathe peacefully despite what happened, I understood what real strength looked like, and it wasn't anything my mother had ever taught me. The first call Mark made that night wasn't loud or dramatic. From the bathroom of our airport hotel room, his voice remained measured, controlled, the same tone he used in Pentagon briefings when lives were at stake. I could only hear fragments through the door. "Senator Holloway, yes, I understand the hour. Concerning an incident I believe you witnessed. Physical assault of my 5-year-old son, Margaret Clark. Yes, that Margaret Clark. I have reason to believe this isn't isolated. Community leadership positions, Children's Charity Board, Parish Council. No, I don't think genuine advocates for children's welfare strike them at holiday gatherings." I sat on the edge of the bed, watching Jackson's chest rise and fall in sleep. His glasses rested on the nightstand, one arm slightly bent from when they'd been knocked from his face. In the soft hotel lamplight, the mark on his cheek had faded, but the memory of his cry remained sharp in my mind. Mark emerged from the bathroom 15 minutes later, his face giving away nothing. He sat beside me, took my hand and kissed it gently. "Try to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Sleep didn't come easily, but exhaustion eventually won. When I woke the next morning, Mark was already dressed, making coffee with the small in-room machine. Jackson was still asleep, curled around the hotel pillow, his dark hair falling across his forehead. "I need to make 2 more calls," Mark said quietly, handing me a steaming cup. "But first, I want to know what you want from this, Claire. This isn't just about consequences. It's about what happens next for you. For Jackson, for all of us. I wrapped my fingers around the warm cup, feeling its heat ground me. I want Jackson to know that what happened wasn't okay. I want my parents to understand they can't treat him, or any child, that way. And I want to stop pretending that things will somehow magically improve if we just keep showing up and taking their abuse. Mark nodded, his blue eyes serious. That's what I thought you'd say. I just needed to hear it. He picked up his secure phone again. I'll be back in 30 minutes. Order breakfast for the 3 of us. After he left, I ordered room service. Pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse for Jackson, eggs and toast for Mark and me. Jackson woke while I was in the shower, and when I came out, he was sitting up in bed, his small fingers tracing patterns on the hotel bedspread. Are we going back to Grandma's today? He asked, voice small. I sat beside him, still in my hotel robe, hair dripping. No, sweetheart. We're going home to Charlotte. Because Grandma hit me? Children's directness can be breathtaking. I chose my words carefully. Yes, what Grandma did was wrong. Very wrong. And we don't stay in places where people hurt us. He seemed to consider this, his 5-year-old mind working through adult complexities. Will Daddy make her say sorry? I smoothed his hair. I don't know if Grandma knows how to say sorry and really mean it. But Daddy is making sure she understands that hurting you was wrong. How? He asked, innocence in his question. Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door, room service with our breakfast. We ate together, Jackson's mood brightening with each bite of syrupy pancake. Mark returned just as we were finishing, his posture relaxed in a way that told me the calls had gone as planned. Bags packed? He asked, helping himself to a piece of my toast. Our flight leaves in 3 hours. As we checked out of the hotel, my phone began buzzing with notifications. First, a text from my brother Carter. What the hell did your husband do? Mom's phone is blowing up. Then, one from Elena, my mother's house manager. Mrs. Clark requests you call her immediately regarding an urgent matter. 3 missed calls from my father. I showed them to Mark, who merely raised an eyebrow. It's starting, he said simply. What is? I asked as we loaded our bags into the shuttle to the airport. Consequences, he replied. Natural, well-deserved consequences. At the airport, while Jackson was distracted by planes taking off through the big windows, Mark finally explained. The first call was to Senator Holloway, who sits on the Children's Welfare Committee and was at your parents' party. He also happens to oversee several funding initiatives that your mother's charities benefit from. I nodded, beginning to understand. The second call was to General Patterson. Your father's defense contracting firm is up for renewal on 3 major Pentagon projects. Patterson and I go back to Afghanistan. He needed to know about character concerns. And the third? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Rivera, who heads the regiment I served with before moving to the Pentagon. The one that provides color guard and ceremonial support for all those society functions your mother loves to chair. The same regiment that staffs the Military Liaison Office for Civilian Charity Partnerships. My mind was putting the pieces together. You didn't ask them to do anything specific, did you? Mark's smile was slight but certain. I didn't have to. Just shared some factual information about what happened to our son. People who care about children's welfare tend to draw their own conclusions. Our flight was called for boarding. As we settled into our seats, Jackson between us with his favorite dinosaur book, my phone buzzed again. A news alert from the Westbrook County Gazette. Annual Winter Charity Ball loses key sponsors amid allegations against chair. I turned my phone off for the flight, feeling something between vindication and grief. Not for what was happening, but for what had never been, the loving family I'd pretended we had for so long. By the time we landed in Charlotte, the situation had escalated. My voicemail was full. Texts flowed in faster than I could read them. But it was an email from my cousin Eliza that finally painted the full picture. Claire, what is happening? Aunt Margaret has been asked to step down from the Children's Foundation Board pending an investigation. Uncle Richard's firm just had 3 contracts put on hold. and the entire winter social calendar is in chaos because the military ceremonial unit pulled out of 6 events. Everyone's talking. Is it true what they're saying about Jackson? Call me. We drove home in silence, watching Charlotte's familiar streets replace the tension of Boston. Our house looked exactly as we'd left it just 48 hours earlier, Christmas lights still blinking cheerfully along the roofline. Inside, it smelled of the cinnamon candles I'd forgotten to extinguish and the pine garland draped across our mantel. Home. Safe. Ours. I put Jackson to bed early, his little body exhausted from travel and emotion. As I tucked him in, he asked one more question. Is Grandma a bad person? The simplicity of children, seeking binary answers for complex human failures. No, sweetheart, I said after a moment. Grandma made a very bad choice. People aren't all good or all bad. But when someone hurts you, you're allowed to keep your distance until you feel safe again. He seemed satisfied with this, drifting to sleep with his stuffed triceratops clutched to his chest. I stood watching him for several minutes, wondering how anyone could look at this gentle boy and choose to hurt him. Downstairs, Mark had poured us each a glass of wine. We sat on the couch, Christmas tree lights casting soft shadows across the living room. You didn't just make 3 calls, did you? I asked finally. He took a sip before answering. The 3 calls I mentioned were real. But yes, there was groundwork before that. Information compiled, patterns documented. Your mother's history of complaints against school teachers who challenged her authority. Your father's company's pattern of ethical shortcuts. I've had concerns for years, Claire. Last night was just the tipping point. Why didn't you tell me? I wasn't angry, just curious. Because you weren't ready to see it, he said gently. You kept hoping they would change, that they would suddenly become the parents you deserved. I respected that hope, even while preparing for the reality that people who abuse power rarely change voluntarily. I leaned against his shoulder, feeling tears build for the first time since leaving Boston. What happens now? Now, he said, wrapping an arm around me. We let natural consequences unfold, we protect Jackson. And we build the family we choose, not the one you were born into. The next morning brought clarity in the harsh light of day. My father finally reached me by phone, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Do you have any idea what your husband has done? He demanded without preamble. 3 decades of business relationships, community standing, social connections, all at risk because you couldn't handle a simple disciplinary moment with your son. I stood in my kitchen, coffee growing cold in my favorite mug, and felt a strange calm settle over me. A disciplinary moment? She struck a 5-year-old child for looking at a toy train. That collection is worth... I don't care if it's worth the GDP of a small nation, I interrupted. Nothing justifies hitting a child. Ever. He scoffed, the sound painfully familiar. This generation with their gentle parenting and participation trophies. We raised you with proper discipline, and you turned out fine. Did I? I wondered. Was constant anxiety fine? Was doubting every decision, fearing criticism, expecting conditional love fine? Dad, I said quietly. Mom slapped my son hard enough to knock his glasses off. In what world is that acceptable? He needs to learn respect for valuable things, my father insisted. And you think pain teaches respect? It doesn't. It teaches fear. And Jackson deserves better than to fear his grandparents. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, your husband called General Patterson. Do you know what that means for our contracts? So that's what this was really about. Not Jackson. Not family. Business. I didn't ask Mark to make that call, I said truthfully, but I'm not sorry he did. Actions have consequences, Dad. Isn't that what you and Mom always taught me? His laugh was bitter. So this is revenge, You're punishing us because you can't handle criticism of your parenting. This isn't revenge, I replied, surprised by my own steadiness. It's protection. And it's long overdue. After we hung up, I sat at our kitchen island, staring at the family photos displayed on our refrigerator. Jackson at the beach last summer, Mark and me on our 10th anniversary, our chosen family, friends who had become more supportive than blood relatives ever were. My mother's call came 2 hours later. Unlike my father, she didn't yell. Her voice was ice, precise and cutting. The Children's Foundation Board has placed me on administrative leave, she said without greeting. 30 years of service, and they treat me like a criminal because of your husband's vindictive calls. Were you planning to tell them you slapped your grandson? I asked. Or was that going to remain our little family secret? Don't be melodramatic, Claire. It was a tap, not abuse. Children need firm boundaries. Boundaries are words, Mom. Rules. Expectations. Not physical pain. She sighed dramatically. I've raised over $12 million for children's causes. One disciplinary action with an unruly child doesn't erase that. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted. The fact that you can't see the hypocrisy in that statement is exactly the problem. The Junior League is reconsidering my Lifetime Achievement Award, she continued as if I hadn't spoken. The Symphony Guild is, reviewing, my position. 3 decades of social capital, threatened because you and your husband couldn't handle family discipline privately. It wasn't discipline, Mom, it was hitting. And maybe the organizations that claim to care about children's welfare should know that their chairperson believes in striking them. The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken truth. Finally, she said, "You've made your choice, Claire. Don't expect things to go back to normal after this little tantrum of yours fades." I don't want things to go back to normal, I replied. Normal was never healthy to begin with. After she hung up, I walked through our home, touching the life Mark and Jackson and I had built together. Photos of beach trips and camping adventures. Jackson's artwork proudly displayed, books and games, and the comfortable clutter of a home where people were more important than appearances. For lunch, Jackson requested grilled cheese cut into dinosaur shapes. As I prepared it, he sat at the counter, legs swinging, telling me about the plane he'd seen at the airport that was bigger than our whole house, probably. This, I realized, was what mattered. Not social standing or family legacy, or holiday gatherings that felt like performances. Just this. A child feeling safe enough to be excited about ordinary things. That afternoon I received an email from my brother Carter's wife, Diane. Unlike the others, hers wasn't angry or demanding. It was hesitant, almost cautious. "Claire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Did your mother really hit Jackson for touching a train set? Because Carter says it was just a tap to redirect him, but the way he described it, I'm concerned. We have the twins coming next year, and I need to know if I should be worried about how your parents might treat them." I stared at the screen, realizing that the consequences of that night were spreading beyond what even Mark might have anticipated. Truth has a way of creating its own momentum once it starts moving. I replied carefully but honestly, describing exactly what happened. No embellishment, no minimizing, just facts. I ended with, "I can't tell you what to do, Diane, but I can tell you that I won't allow Jackson around my parents unless something fundamentally changes in how they view children and discipline." Her response came quickly. "Thank you for your honesty. I have some thinking to do." That evening, I created a new family calendar on our kitchen wall. January was blank except for Jackson's return to kindergarten and Mark's 3-day trip to Washington. No family obligations. No performances disguised as celebrations. Just the rhythm of our own choosing. Mark found me there, staring at the empty squares. "Having regrets?" he asked softly. I shook my head. The opposite. I'm realizing how much energy went into managing their expectations, navigating their judgment. It's like putting down a heavy backpack I didn't know I was carrying. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Your parents will try to regain control," he said. "They'll have flying monkeys, friends, relatives, guilt trips. Are you prepared for that?" I turned in his arms to face him. I'm done living for their approval. I've spent my entire life trying to earn what should have been freely given. Love without conditions, acceptance without performance. Jackson deserves better than that legacy. So do I. Later that night, after Jackson was asleep, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I began typing a letter, not to my parents, but to myself. A declaration of independence from patterns that had shaped my life for too long, a promise to the child I once was, and to the child sleeping down the hall. I wrote about boundaries and consequences, about the difference between discipline and punishment, about breaking cycles that had persisted for generations, and most importantly, about building something new from the ashes of what needed to burn. As I wrote, an email notification appeared in the corner of my screen. From my cousin Eliza again, subject line, "You should see this." Attached was a screenshot of a social media post from the Westbrook Community Foundation. The board of directors announces with regret that Margaret Clark has resigned from her position as chairperson, effective immediately. The foundation remains committed to the welfare and protection of all children in our community. I closed the laptop without finishing my letter. Some things don't need to be written to be true. Some boundaries don't need explanation to be necessary. And some consequences arrive not as revenge, but as long overdue correction to a story that needed rewriting. That night, I slept without dreams for the first time in years. The weight of pretending had finally been lifted, replaced by the lighter burden of truth. My parents had spent decades building a castle of appearances, and in one evening it had begun to crumble, not because of spite or malice, but because structures built on falsehood cannot stand forever. What I didn't know then was that the most important call Mark made that night wasn't to the senator, the general, or the colonel. It was to someone whose influence would prove far more significant in the months to come. Someone whose connection to my family ran deeper than social ties or professional networks. Someone who had been waiting for years for the truth to finally emerge. A week after Christmas, life in Charlotte resumed its normal rhythm. Jackson returned to kindergarten, his incident with Grandma fading into that merciful space where children store difficult memories, not forgotten, but softened around the edges. Mark flew to Washington for meetings at the Pentagon, and I dove back into my work as an educational consultant, helping schools develop more supportive environments for children with learning differences. On the surface, everything looked ordinary, but underneath, seismic shifts were happening in my family's landscape. My parents hadn't called again after those initial conversations. Carter and Diane had gone suspiciously quiet. The only updates came through cousins and family friends, nervous texts asking what was happening, why Margaret and Richard had suddenly stepped down from various boards, why 3 charity events had been abruptly canceled. I answered honestly, but briefly. There was an incident at Christmas. My mother struck Jackson for looking at a train set. We're taking some space from my parents while they hopefully reflect on their actions. Some responded with shock and support. Others with dismissive comments about modern parenting and oversensitivity. A few simply stopped responding altogether, choosing sides without saying so explicitly. Family allegiances rearranged themselves like tectonic plates after an earthquake, some moving closer, others drifting permanently away. On a Wednesday afternoon in mid-January, I was reviewing curriculum proposals at our dining room table when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Boston number. I answered cautiously. "Claire Westfield?" The voice was warm, professional, female. "Yes, this is Claire. My name is Dr. Rebecca Townsend. I'm a clinical psychologist in Boston. I work with trauma survivors, particularly adults recovering from childhood emotional abuse." I sat up straighter, pencil paused mid-note. "How can I help you, Dr. Townsend?" There was a moment of hesitation before she continued. "I'm calling because I received a rather unusual contact from your husband, Mark. He reached out to me the night of your family's Christmas gathering." The third call? I held my breath. "He shared some concerning observations about patterns of behavior in your family of origin. Normally, I wouldn't reach out like this, but he mentioned you're an educational consultant focused on creating supportive environments for children." "That's right," I said, trying to understand where this was heading. "I've been working on a research project," she explained, "documenting intergenerational patterns of emotional control and punishment-based parenting." The impact on adult survivors, their parenting choices, their ability to break cycles. Your husband thought you might be interested in contributing your perspective. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. Not revenge, not just consequences, something constructive. Something that might actually help others. I would, I said finally. I'd be very interested. Wonderful. This isn't therapy, Claire, though I'd certainly recommend that separately for anyone dealing with family trauma. This is documentation, bringing hidden patterns into the light, naming what happens behind closed doors in, respectable, families. We arranged to meet via video call the following week. After we hung up, I sat staring at my curriculum notes without seeing them, thoughts swirling. Mark hadn't just called people who could create immediate consequences for my parents. He'd reached out to someone who could help transform our painful experience into something meaningful. That night, I called him in Washington. So the third call wasn't to Colonel Rivera, I said when he answered. His smile was audible in his voice. Rivera was the second call. The third was to Dr. Townsend. I met her through a Pentagon initiative on veteran family support. She's been researching generational trauma patterns for years, specifically in high-functioning, socially respected families, the kind that hide abuse behind achievement and status. Like my parents, I said softly. Like your parents, he agreed. But this isn't about exposing them personally, Claire. It's about exposing the pattern, breaking the silence, creating change beyond just our family. I felt tears welling, but they weren't from sadness. You really thought this through. I've been watching your parents operate for 15 years, he said. Watching how they use social pressure, conditional approval, subtle humiliation, how they treated you, how they were starting to treat Jackson. The slap was just the visible part of a much deeper problem. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and began typing, not a letter this time, but notes. Memories, patterns I'd normalized for so long that they seemed invisible until now. The time my mother refused to speak to me for 3 days because I'd worn the wrong dress to a cousin's wedding. My father's habit of comparing my achievements unfavorably to Carter's. The constant moving of goalposts, so that success never quite arrived. Approval always remained just out of reach. Writing it down was like excavating buried artifacts, painful but clarifying. By midnight, I had 8 pages of notes, concrete examples spanning from early childhood to our recent Christmas disaster. What struck me most wasn't any single incident, but the consistency of the message. Love was conditional, worth was performance-based, and family loyalty meant accepting mistreatment without complaint. The video call with Dr. Townsend took place the following Tuesday. She was in her Boston office. Warm lighting, bookshelves, credentials framed discreetly on the wall behind her. I sat in my home office, notes beside me, unexpectedly nervous. Before we begin, she said after introductions, I want to be clear about something. What happened to your son, being struck by his grandmother, was unequivocally wrong. Full stop. There is no context that makes hitting a child acceptable. I nodded, throat suddenly tight. But I suspect that incident wasn't isolated. She continued. It was likely part of a larger pattern that you yourself experienced growing up. That's what I'm interested in documenting. How these patterns perpetuate, and more importantly, how they can be broken. For the next 2 hours, I shared my notes and memories. Dr. Townsend listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or pointing out connections I hadn't noticed. She didn't seem shocked by anything I described. Not the emotional manipulation, not the conditional love, not the public performances of perfect family life that masked private dysfunction. What you're describing, she said toward the end, is what we call a high-functioning narcissistic family system. The parents maintain an impressive social image while using various control tactics privately. Children are valued for how they enhance the family's reputation, not for who they are inherently. That sounds exactly right, I said, the terminology giving shape to what I'd felt but couldn't name. The reason your mother's slap was so significant, she explained, is that it broke the cardinal rule of such systems, keeping the dysfunction private. By striking Jackson in front of witnesses outside the immediate family, she crossed a line that made the pattern visible to others. I hadn't thought of it that way before, and that's why they're so angry about the consequences. Not because they think they did nothing wrong, but because it was exposed? Precisely. Dr. Townsend nodded. In these systems, appearance is everything. Being seen accurately is the greatest threat. As our call wound down, she asked one final question. Claire, what made you decide to protect Jackson in a way you weren't protected yourself? Many people from backgrounds like yours perpetuate the patterns they experienced. You chose differently. Why? I considered this carefully. When Jackson was born, I made him a promise. I looked at this tiny person who trusted me completely, and I promised him I would never make him earn my love. That he would always be enough exactly as he was. When my mother struck him, I realized I couldn't keep that promise while allowing him to be treated as I had been. Dr. Townsend smiled. That's how cycles break. Not all at once, but in moments of choice where we decide the past stops with us. After our call, I felt lighter somehow, as if naming the patterns had diminished their power. I was loading the dishwasher that evening when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Claire, it's Diane. I'm using my personal phone. We need to talk privately. Can you call when you have a moment? It's important. Carter's wife. My brother's wife. Reaching out secretly. I dried my hands and called immediately. Thank you for calling back, Diane said, her voice hushed. I can only talk for a few minutes. Carter's at a business dinner. Is everything okay? I asked. No, she said simply. Nothing's been okay for a while. Claire, I've been thinking about what happened at Christmas. About what you told me regarding your mother hitting Jackson. I waited, sensing she needed space to find her words. Carter said I was overreacting, that it was normal discipline. But then... Her voice faltered. Last week, your mother was helping me organize the nursery for the twins. I moved something she'd arranged, and she grabbed my wrist. Hard. Said I needed to do things the right way if I wanted to be a proper Clark mother. My stomach tightened. Diane. It left marks, she continued, voice steadier now. Actual bruises. When I showed Carter, he said I must have bumped into something and forgotten. That your mother would never do that. That I was being hormonal and dramatic. The familiar gaslighting script. I'd heard variations my entire childhood. I believe you, I said firmly, and I'm so sorry that happened to you. She exhaled shakily. The thing is, Claire, it made me wonder, if she'd do this to me, an adult, pregnant with her grandchildren, what might she do to the twins when they're born? If Jackson touching a train set warranted a slap, what happens when a baby cries too long or makes a mess? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Carter worships his parents. He thinks they're perfect. But I'm scared, Claire, not just of your mother, but of raising children in this environment where hurting people is normalized. I closed my eyes, heart aching for her. Diane, do you have somewhere safe you could go if you needed to? Family, friends? My sister in Providence, she said without hesitation. Why? Just making sure you have options, I replied carefully. Pregnancy is vulnerable enough without adding family tension. Your priority needs to be your health, and those babies. We talked for a few more minutes. I gave her Dr. Townsend's information and promised to check in regularly. After we hung up, I sat on our back porch, watching darkness settle over the yard where Jackson's swing set stood silhouetted against the evening sky. The pattern was expanding beyond me now. The small crack that began with one slap was spreading, revealing fault lines throughout the entire family structure. I wondered how many others had been silently enduring similar treatment, believing it was normal or deserved. The next morning, I received an email from my mother's sister, Aunt Patricia. We'd never been particularly close. She lived in California and visited rarely, but her message was direct. Claire, I've heard disturbing rumors about what happened at Christmas. Margaret isn't returning my calls. Richard gives me political non-answers. I need to know, did my sister actually strike Jackson? Because if she did, we have a serious family problem that's been ignored for too long. I replied truthfully, describing what happened without embellishment. Her response came within the hour. I feared as much. Claire, there's something you should know. This isn't new behavior. Margaret did similar things when we were children, to me, to our younger brother Thomas. Our parents ignored it, called it Margaret's strong personality. When she had you and Carter, I worried history would repeat itself, but Richard assured everyone he would. Keep her in check. I've carried guilt for decades about not speaking up. I'm sorry. Pieces began falling into place. My mother's behavior wasn't just about control or status. It was a pattern stretching back generations, enabled by silence and denial. But now the silence was breaking. That weekend, Mark returned from Washington. We sat on the back porch after Jackson was asleep, sharing a bottle of wine and catching up. I told him about Dr. Townsend, about Diane's secret call, about Aunt Patricia's revelation. It's like once the first domino fell, everything started shifting. I said, watching moths circle our porch light. People coming forward, sharing similar experiences, questioning what they've accepted. Mark took my hand. That's how change happens. Not all at once, but person by person, truth by truth. Your parents built their image on everyone staying silent. Now that silence is breaking. But what happens next? I asked. To my parents, to Carter and Diane, to the extended family? Everything feels unstable. It was always unstable, he said gently. The foundation was never solid. Now we rebuild on truth instead of appearances. The following Wednesday, I was at work when my assistant said Carter was in the lobby asking to see me. My brother and I hadn't spoken since Christmas. I found him pacing near the reception desk, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His normally perfect hair was uncombed, his tie loosened. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice tight. "Privately?" I led him to my office and closed the door. Before I could speak, he burst out. "Diane left. She took a bag last night. Said she's staying with her sister until she figures things out. She says she doesn't feel safe around Mom. That's crazy, right? Mom would never hurt her." I stayed silent, watching realization dawn slowly on my brother's face. "Unless," he faltered, "unless that's not crazy. Unless what happened with Jackson wasn't isolated. Claire, tell me honestly, was Mom like this with us growing up? Did I just not see it?" The question was so naked, so vulnerable that my irritation melted. She was, Carter, in different ways with each of us, but yes. He sank into the chair across from my desk, hands covering his face. "I've been telling Diane she's overreacting. That pregnancy is making her emotional. But those bruises on her wrist. God, Claire, I saw them. I just couldn't believe Mom would." "It's hard to see what we've been trained not to notice," I said quietly. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "I've been so angry at you and Mark, blaming you for destroying Mom and Dad's reputation. For weeks. That's all I could think about. The embarrassment, the social fallout, the business implications. Not once did I question whether Jackson deserved protection. I felt my throat tighten. And now? Now I'm wondering what kind of father I'll be if I can't even protect my wife," he said, voice breaking. "If I'm so invested in preserving appearances that I doubt her when she's clearly hurting." We talked for over an hour. Really talked, perhaps for the first time as adults. About our childhood. About the constant competition our parents fostered between us. About how Carter had been the golden child and I the scapegoat, neither role offering genuine security or acceptance. "I need to make things right with Diane," he said as he prepared to leave. "I don't know if she'll forgive me for not believing her, for choosing our parents over her." "Start by truly listening," I suggested. "Not to defend or explain away, but to understand." That's what Mark did for me, and it changed everything. He nodded, then paused at the door. "Claire, I'm sorry. For Christmas, for not standing up for Jackson, for all of it. You were right to protect him. I just couldn't see it." After he left, I sat at my desk, too emotional to return to work immediately. Another crack in the facade. Another family member choosing truth over appearance. The conversation felt like a small miracle. Painful but necessary, like setting a broken bone so it could finally heal properly. That evening, I received a text from Diane. "Carter came to Providence. We talked for hours, really talked. Thank you for whatever you said to him. For the first time, I feel like he's seeing clearly. Later, after Jackson was asleep, I found Mark in our home office reviewing documents. I perched on the edge of his desk, thinking about the cascade of events since Christmas. "You know," I said, "when you made those calls the night my mother slapped Jackson, I thought it was about consequences, protection. But it was more than that, wasn't it?" He set his papers down. "I knew your parents wouldn't change from consequences alone. People like that rarely do. But I hoped that breaking the silence might create space for healing. Not just for us, but for everyone caught in their web." I leaned down to kiss him softly. "You didn't just protect our son, you started a revolution." He smiled. "No, Claire. You did that when you walked out of your parents' house, instead of accepting their explanation. The calls just amplified what you'd already begun." As January turned to February, small but significant shifts continued throughout the extended family. Aunt Patricia reached out to other relatives, creating a private online group for those who'd experienced similar treatment from my mother. Carter and Diane entered couples counseling, working to rebuild trust and prepare for healthier parenthood. Even my father's sister, long estranged for reasons no one discussed, re-established contact after hearing about the Christmas incident. What had begun as a single act of protection for one child was becoming a watershed moment for an entire family system. Not everyone chose awareness. Some relatives doubled down, defending my parents and cutting contact with those of us speaking out. But enough people chose truth that the balance of power was shifting. My parents remained notably silent through all of this. No calls, no texts, no attempts at reconciliation. Only rumors filtered through the family grapevine. My father's business struggling without Pentagon contracts. My mother's social calendar suddenly empty, their perfect image crumbling daily as more stories emerged. I didn't take pleasure in their difficulties. There was no satisfaction in watching the consequences unfold, only a sense of necessary correction, like gravity finally acting on a structure that had defied natural laws for too long. What gave me hope wasn't their suffering, but the healing happening elsewhere. Carter listening to Diane, cousins supporting each other, long-buried truths finally acknowledged. Family members who had been isolated in their pain were finding connection, building something new from the fragments of what had broken. One evening in early February, Jackson came to me while I was folding laundry. "Mom," he asked, his small face serious, "are we going to see Grandma and Grandpa for Valentine's Day?" I set down the towel I was folding. "No, sweetheart. Not this year." "Because of the slap?" Direct as always. "Yes," I said honestly, "and because they haven't said they're sorry or shown they want to change." He considered this, brow furrowed in concentration. "My teacher, Ms. Johnson, says everyone deserves a second chance if they're really sorry." "That's often true," I agreed. "But being sorry means understanding what you did wrong and working hard to do better. It's not just saying words." He nodded solemnly. "Like when I pushed Ben on the playground and had to think about safer choices, not just say sorry?" "Exactly like that," I smiled. "Grandma and Grandpa haven't shown they're thinking about safer choices yet." This seemed to satisfy him. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Mom? I'm glad you and Dad make safer choices with me." His words stayed with me long after he'd gone to play. Children see more clearly than we often give them credit for. Jackson understood the situation with a simplicity that cut through all the adult complications. People who hurt others shouldn't be around until they learn safer choices. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I'd started doing regularly since speaking with Dr. Townsend. I wrote about the ripple effects of one moment of clarity, about family systems creaking under the weight of truth, about the quiet revolution happening one conversation at a time. I wrote about the courage it takes to break generational patterns, to choose discomfort over familiar dysfunction, and about the unexpected allies who emerge when we dare to stand firm in what we know is right. The last thing I wrote before closing my journal was a quote Dr. Townsend had shared. "Healing doesn't mean the damage never existed. It means the damage no longer controls our lives." As I set my journal aside, I realized that's exactly what was happening, not just for me, but for an expanding circle of family members finding their voices after years of silence. The damage hadn't disappeared, but but its power was diminishing, with every truth spoken, every boundary established, every choice to prioritize health over appearance. What I couldn't know then was that the most significant conversation was still to come, one that would challenge everything I thought I understood about my family's history and the true origins of my mother's behavior. A conversation that would begin with an unexpected letter from someone I'd never met, arriving exactly 1 month after that fateful Christmas night. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late February. Plain white envelope, unfamiliar handwriting, postmarked from a small town in Maine I'd never heard of. I almost missed it among the bills and catalogs, but something about the careful penmanship caught my eye. No return address, just my name and home address written in steady blue ink. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery and a faded photograph. I unfolded the letter first. Dear Claire, you don't know me, but I know a great deal about you and your family. My name is Eleanor Winters. For 27 years, I was your grandmother, Evelyn Clark's personal nurse and companion. I've debated sending this letter for weeks, but after hearing about what happened at Christmas through mutual connections, I believe you deserve to know certain truths that have been carefully hidden. Your grandmother didn't die of heart failure as you were told. She died by suicide after decades of emotional and physical abuse from your grandfather Harold, abuse that your mother Margaret witnessed throughout her childhood. What your mother did to your son is inexcusable, but it's part of a pattern that began long before she was born. If you want to know more, I'm still in the same cottage on the Clark estate in Harborview. Your grandfather's will stipulated I could live here until my death. I'm 83 now and don't travel, but my door is open if you wish to visit. With care, Eleanor Winters. The photograph slipped from my fingers and fell to the kitchen floor. I bent to retrieve it. A black and white image, edges yellowed with age. It showed a young woman I barely recognized as my grandmother, perhaps in her 30s, standing beside a much older Eleanor. They were in what looked like a garden, smiling cautiously at the camera. My grandmother's sleeve had slipped, revealing what appeared to be fingerprint bruises on her upper arm. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, letter trembling in my hand. The narrative I'd constructed about my family, controlling, status-obsessed parents who valued appearance over genuine connection, suddenly seemed incomplete. There were deeper layers, older wounds informing the present. Mark found me still sitting there 20 minutes later, when he returned from picking up Jackson from school. One look at my face told him something significant had happened. "Jackson," he said gently, "why don't you go play in your room for a bit? Mom and I need to talk." Once Jackson was upstairs, I handed Mark the letter and photo without comment. He read it carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to somber understanding. "What are you thinking?" he asked when he finished. "That I've spent my life seeing my mother as the architect of all our family dysfunction?" I said slowly. "What if she was also a victim of it? What if what she did to me, what she did to Jackson, was part of a cycle going back generations? Does that change how you feel about her actions?" Mark asked, not challenging, just clarifying. I considered this carefully. "It doesn't excuse them. Understanding isn't the same as forgiving. But it might explain some things. And maybe—" I paused, the thought still forming. Maybe healing isn't just about breaking my connection to harmful patterns. Maybe it's about understanding their origins. Mark nodded. "So, Harborview, Maine? You think I should go?" "I think you won't rest until you do," he said simply. 3 days later, I was on a small commuter plane, headed to coastal Maine. I'd arranged for Jackson to stay with Mark's parents. Loving grandparents who measured success by the happiness of their grandchildren, not their obedience. Mark had offered to come with me, but something told me this journey needed to be mine alone. Harborview was exactly as its name suggested, a small coastal town where gray-shingled houses perched on rocky bluffs overlooking the Atlantic. In February, it was eerily quiet, summer homes shuttered for the season, only year-round residents braving the wind that cut through my coat as I navigated the rental car along narrow roads. The Clark estate sat at the end of a private drive, smaller than I'd imagined from family stories but still imposing, a 3-story Victorian with a wraparound porch, weathered by decades of salt air. Beyond the main house, partially hidden by pine trees, stood a small cottage. Smoke curled from its chimney, the only sign of life on the otherwise silent property. I parked and approached the cottage. heart pounding. Before I could knock, the door opened, revealing a small woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Despite her age, Eleanor Winters stood straight, her blue eyes sharp and clear. "You look like her," she said by way of greeting. "Not Margaret. Evelyn, same eyes. Thank you for seeing me." I managed, suddenly unsure what to say now that I was actually here. She gestured me inside. The cottage was warm. Walls lined with bookshelves, a fire crackling in a small stone hearth. Photos covered one wall, many showing my grandmother at different ages, some including a younger Eleanor, a few with children I recognized as my mother and her siblings. "Tea?" Eleanor asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Please." While she prepared it, I studied the photos, looking for clues, for signs I might have missed in the carefully curated family history I'd been taught. In one image, my grandmother stood on this same porch, perhaps in her 40s, smile not quite reaching her eyes, hand clutching her collar as if holding herself together. "That was after a particularly bad night," Eleanor said, returning with a tray. "Harold had broken 3 of her ribs the evening before, but appearances had to be maintained, so we took the annual summer photo anyway." I turned, shocked by her directness. "How long did this go on?" 42 years of marriage," Eleanor replied, pouring tea into delicate cups that seemed incongruous with our conversation. "From their wedding night until his death." We sat in armchairs facing the fire. Outside, the winter sea churned, gray and restless against the shore below the bluff. "Why didn't she leave?" I asked, then immediately regretted the simplicity of the question. Eleanor's smile was sad. "The same reason they all stay. Fear. Financial control. Children to protect. And in Evelyn's case, nowhere to go. Her family had disowned her for marrying Harold. They saw through him even then. By the time she realized her mistake, she was trapped." I sipped my tea, trying to absorb the reality of what I was hearing. "And my mother? She witnessed this?" "Margaret was his favorite," Eleanor said, the words heavy with implication. "Harold never hit her. Instead, he made her his confidant, his little princess. He would explain to her why Mommy needed to be disciplined, because she was disrespectful, because she questioned him, because she didn't appreciate all he provided." The parallels to my own childhood were chilling. My mother's obsession with appearances, her belief that love was earned through performance, her swift punishment for any perceived defiance. "She was groomed to see abuse as love," I whispered. Eleanor nodded. By the time Margaret was 10, she would sometimes stand beside Harold while he berated Evelyn, adding her own criticisms. Not because she was inherently cruel, but because she'd learned that aligning with power was the only safe position. My mother's siblings, my Uncle James and Aunt Sarah, they saw this too. James tried to protect Evelyn when he could. He joined the Navy at 17, came back for her after his first deployment, begged her to leave with him. She refused, afraid of what Harold might do to Margaret, who by then was fully under his influence. Sarah simply disconnected, emotionally shut down. Last I heard, she was living in Australia, hasn't been back to the States in 30 years. I set my cup down, hands suddenly unsteady. "Why are you telling me this now? Why not years ago?" Eleanor looked toward the fire, silent for a moment. "I made a promise to Evelyn before she died that I wouldn't expose the family secrets while Harold lived. After his death, Margaret made it clear that speaking about the past would result in my eviction from this cottage, the only home I've known for decades. What changed?" "2 things," she said, turning back to me. "First, I'm 83. I've outlived most of the people who could hurt me, and frankly, I've stopped fearing the rest. Second, when I heard what happened to your son, history repeating itself in exactly the way Evelyn feared it would, silence no longer felt like an option." I looked down at my hands, seeing for the first time how they resembled my grandmother's in the photos. Same long fingers, same slight bend at the knuckles. Did my grandmother know about how my mother was raising us? Eleanor's expression softened. "She tried to intervene once, when you were about 7. She came to visit and saw Margaret slap you for spilling juice on a tablecloth. She confronted your mother privately, and Margaret banned her from visiting for nearly 2 years afterward. By the time contact resumed, Evelyn was already ill. She never got another chance. A memory surfaced. Grandmother sending me books with notes tucked inside. Keep your light, little one, you're stronger than you know. Messages I'd treasured without understanding their deeper meaning. The official story is that my grandmother died of heart failure, I said. But your letter said… She took an overdose of her heart medication, Eleanor confirmed. 3 months after Harold's death. Everyone assumed grief, but those of us who knew her understood. She couldn't imagine building a new life after decades of captivity. And she'd lost her children to Harold's influence. Margaret had become his proxy, James was estranged, Sarah unreachable. She left a letter, Eleanor continued, rising to retrieve a small wooden box from a bookshelf. For you, actually, to be given when you were old enough to understand. Margaret found it first and destroyed it, but not before I read it and memorized parts. Evelyn saw something in you, a strength, a clarity she thought might eventually break the cycle. She handed me a small notebook. I wrote down what I remembered. It's not her exact words, but the essence is there. I opened it with trembling fingers. Eleanor's neat handwriting filled several pages. I read silently. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, I've found courage too late to help you directly. I recognized in you, even as a small child, the same spark Harold tried to extinguish in me, the ability to see truth even when everyone insists on lies. Your mother learned from her father that love is control, that fear creates respect, that appearances matter more than authentic connection. She is continuing what was done to our family, not because she is cruel by nature, but because cruelty was normalized as love. You have a choice she never fully had. You can break this chain. You can refuse to accept that love must hurt to be real. You can build something different if you're brave enough to see clearly what's been hidden. Know that whatever you've been told about me, my greatest regret was not protecting your mother from becoming what she feared. My greatest hope is that you will protect yourself and any children you may have from this legacy. With love that asks nothing in return, your grandmother Evelyn. Tears blurred my vision as I closed the notebook. Outside, snow had begun falling, soft flakes swirling against the darkening sky. Eleanor sat quietly, allowing me space to process what I'd learned. She killed herself the day after Margaret told her she was raising Carter and me exactly as Harold had instructed, that his methods produced successful children, I said finally, the pieces connecting. She realized the cycle would continue. Eleanor nodded. The funeral was perfectly orchestrated. Margaret made sure everything looked appropriate. No mention of suicide, of course. No acknowledgement of the decades of abuse. Just tributes to a loving marriage that was anything but. And my grandfather's business? His reputation in the community? Built on charm, fear, and strategic cruelty, Eleanor said. Harold could be captivating when needed. Community leader, philanthropist, devoted family man, all carefully constructed images that hid the private terror he created. Your father Richard fit right in, another man who understood that power often wears a polished smile. We talked until the light faded completely, Eleanor filling in gaps in my family history that had been deliberately obscured. The rumors of Harold's affairs. The mysterious accidents that befell Evelyn whenever she showed too much independence. The staff who were dismissed for asking too many questions. The community that suspected but never intervened. What happened after my grandmother died? I asked as our conversation wound down. Margaret took control of everything, Eleanor explained. The estate, the family narrative, the social connections. She became a perfect replica of Harold, maintaining his illusion of the flawless Clark family while continuing his methods of control behind closed doors. And no one stopped her. By then, everyone who might have was gone, silenced, or complicit, Eleanor said, including me, I'm ashamed to say. I kept my promise to Evelyn about not exposing Harold, and in doing so, I enabled Margaret to continue his legacy. As I prepared to leave, snow now falling heavily outside, Eleanor took my hand. Her skin felt paper thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong. What you did, protecting your son, refusing to accept the family narrative, It's what Evelyn hoped for, but couldn't achieve herself. You've already broken the most important link in the chain. Quote. I hugged her, this stranger who had given me more truth in one afternoon than my family had in a lifetime. Thank you for your courage, I whispered. It can't have been easy to carry these secrets for so long. The burden of truth is lighter than the weight of silence, she replied. Remember that. The drive back to my hotel through swirling snow gave me time to reflect. The story I'd constructed about my family, about my mother's cruelty, my father's enablement, my brother's complicity, wasn't wrong, but it was incomplete. They weren't simply villains in my life story. They were damaged people continuing a cycle they hadn't created, but hadn't found the strength to break. Understanding this didn't diminish my resolve to protect Jackson or my commitment to healthier patterns. If anything, it strengthened my determination. The cycle had continued for at least 3 generations that I knew of, possibly more before that. It would end with me. Back in my hotel room, I called Mark. After sharing what I'd learned, I asked the question that had been forming since leaving Eleanor's cottage. What if healing isn't just about cutting ties? What if it also means offering a chance for change, not for my sake, but for the possibility that even the most entrenched patterns can be broken? What are you thinking? Mark asked, his voice steady through the phone. I'm thinking about boundaries versus barriers, I said slowly. Boundaries protect while leaving room for change. Barriers just wall people out permanently. And you're considering boundaries with your parents rather than permanent barriers? Not yet, I clarified. Not until there's genuine acknowledgement and change. But I'm considering the possibility that change might someday be possible, even if it's unlikely. The next morning, before flying home, I wrote 3 letters at the small desk in my hotel room. The first was to my mother, not offering reconciliation, but naming the generational pattern I now understood, and expressing hope that she might someday find healing from her own childhood wounds. I made clear that access to Jackson would require demonstrated change, not just apologies or promises. I acknowledged that such change might never happen, and that I was prepared for that reality. The second letter was to Carter, sharing what I'd learned about our grandparents and the legacy of abuse that had shaped our mother. Not to excuse her behavior, but to help him understand the fuller context as he and Diane prepared to become parents themselves. The third letter was to Eleanor, thanking her for her courage and enclosing my contact information with an invitation to remain connected. Whatever happened with my parents, I wanted this link to my grandmother's truth to remain intact. On the flight home, I watched clouds pass beneath the plane, thinking about how family legacies travel through generations, not just through DNA, but through behaviors, beliefs, and unspoken rules. How patterns of harm can masquerade as tradition, as love, as proper upbringing. And how breaking those patterns requires not just walking away, but understanding their origins clearly enough to dismantle them completely. When I landed in Charlotte, Mark and Jackson were waiting at the gate. Jackson ran to me, throwing his arms around my waist with the uninhibited joy only children can express. Mark's embrace followed, solid and secure. Welcome home, he said softly. Find what you were looking for? More than I expected, I replied. It's not a happy story, but it's one I needed to know. That evening, after Jackson was asleep, Mark and I sat on our back porch despite the February chill. I showed him the notebook Eleanor had given me, my grandmother's words, now a tangible connection to a woman I'd never truly known. It's strange, I said, watching stars appear in the clear Carolina sky. I've spent so long seeing my mother as simply cruel or controlling. Now I see her as someone who never had the chance to learn a different way. It doesn't excuse what she did to me or to Jackson, but it helps me understand why breaking the cycle was so difficult for her. And easier for you? Mark asked. I considered this. Not easier, just possible. I had things she didn't. A partner who saw clearly, therapy, distance from the family system, information about what was happening. Most importantly, I had a choice she probably never felt she had. So what now? He asked. For you? For us? For the extended family? Now we keep building something different, I said. We maintain boundaries where needed. We stay open to genuine change if it comes. We share what we've learned with those who are ready to hear it. And we make sure Jackson grows up understanding that love doesn't hurt, that his worth isn't measured by performance, and that family means safety, not fear. Mark squeezed my hand. My mother never responded to my letter directly. Instead, she sent a formal note through her attorney, acknowledging receipt and indicating she had no comment at this time. My father remained similarly silent. I hadn't expected immediate change, and their response confirmed that meaningful transformation, if it ever came, would take time and probably professional help. What surprised me was how many other family members reached out. Cousins, distant relatives, even former household staff, each with their own stories that fit into the larger pattern. The family's secret hadn't been a secret at all, just a collective agreement not to speak about what everyone had observed. Dr. Townsend continued her research, incorporating these anonymous stories into her work on high-functioning family trauma systems. What you've uncovered, she told me during a follow-up call, is textbook intergenerational trauma transmission. The difference is that you've interrupted the pattern consciously, which is remarkably rare. By early spring, Eleanor had become a regular presence in our lives through weekly phone calls. Jackson loved hearing her stories about Maine and the wildlife around her cottage. Mark helped arrange for improvements to her heating system and roof repairs she'd been unable to manage alone. She became the grandmother figure Jackson deserved. Interested in his thoughts, respectful of his boundaries, genuinely delighted by his unique perspective. One evening in April, as cherry blossoms began appearing throughout Charlotte, I received an unexpected email. The sender was my mother's longtime assistant, Vivian. "Claire, your mother doesn't know I'm contacting you. Yesterday, I found her in her office looking at old photos, specifically ones of your grandmother, Evelyn. When I asked if she needed anything, she said something that surprised me. I think I've become my father." She then asked me to find information about therapists specializing in trauma. "I thought you should know." I read the message twice, careful not to attach too much hope to what might be a momentary insight rather than a genuine turning point. Still, it was the first crack in the fortress of denial my mother had maintained for decades. That night, I added a new page to the journal I'd been keeping since Christmas. I wrote about how healing isn't linear, how understanding can come in fragments, how change happens in barely perceptible increments, how breaking generational patterns requires both firm boundaries and persistent hope. I wrote about Jackson, now approaching 6, who had begun asking thoughtful questions about family, about rules, about why some adults behave in hurtful ways, how his natural empathy remained intact despite what he'd experienced, and how his ability to name his feelings without shame represented a seismic shift from my own childhood experiences. Most importantly, I wrote about the quiet revolution happening in living rooms, therapy offices, and late-night conversations across our extended family. How naming the pattern had diminished its power. How people who had felt isolated in their experiences were finding connection and validation. How the silence that had protected abusers for generations was finally being broken, not with dramatic confrontations, but with steady truth-telling and boundaries that made space for healing. The last thing I wrote that night was a message to my grandmother, Evelyn, words she would never read but that I needed to express. "I found the truth you hoped I would. I'm breaking the chain you couldn't. I'm building the family you dreamed of but never experienced. Your courage wasn't wasted. It just took time to flower. Rest peacefully knowing that your great-grandson will never know the fear you lived with, and that the strength you saw in me has become a shield for him and a bridge for others. The legacy of harm ends here. What rises in its place is what you always deserved. Love without conditions, family without fear, truth without shame." Outside, spring rain began falling softly, washing away the last traces of winter. Inside, the home we built remained warm, secure, filled with books and art, and the quiet certainty that love doesn't require perfection or performance, just presence, protection, and the courage to see clearly even when the truth is painful. The cycle that began generations before me hadn't ended with a dramatic confrontation or a perfect resolution. It had ended with a choice, repeated daily in small moments and large ones, the choice to see clearly, to speak honestly, to protect fiercely, and to build consciously something better than what came before. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.